This is the Troutbitten Podcast.
Troutbitten.
Troutbitten?
Troutbitten.
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 Yeah, Troutbitten.
Troutbitten.
It's about trout. Wild trout. This is Troutbitten.
This is the Troutbitten Podcast, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Dominic Swentowski. I'm the owner of Troutbitten and the author of Troutbitten.com. All right, here we go. This is episode 1 of season 7. I have my full crew of fishing friends with me, the guys you've come to know and love. And we're here to talk about angler pressure. This is a big one. It's a topic that everyone in the fishing world loves to talk about. They love to complain about angler pressure, and they have theories about how it affects things. So we're breaking this into 2 parts. And tonight, this one is about how angler pressure affects the fish. And for the next episode, next week, the topic will be how angler pressure affects the fishing. One topic sets up a good conversation of the other, and there's a lot to tackle in this first episode alone, like trout selectivity, feeding patterns, migration, trout growth rates, trout conditioning, grouping up or spreading out, and then a lot more things too. And all of that is how angler pressure affects the fish. Angler pressure probably isn't going to trend the other way. Like, we have to acknowledge that. For most of us, more casts are made to the waters we fish by more anglers than ever before, because there are more fishermen, just as there are more runners and golfers and bikers. Every sport these days has better access to information about techniques and about where and when to go. And there's specialized gear that is easily available and fun to buy. Let's just admit it. So we'll get to all of that in a moment, but let me welcome back the Troutbitten guys. This season returns to the full crew format with free-form discussions and a different topic every week. These are my friends on and off the river, and these are the guys who help keep this Troutbitten engine running in many different ways. Let me introduce my friend Bill Dell. Bill lives in Western Pennsylvania, but he fishes over here in Central just as much. Bill guides for Troutbitten, provides much of the photography that you see on the website, and he's a tireless angler who wears out waders and boots quicker than anyone. Bill, how you doing?
Doing good. Glad to be back.
Who's your favorite fisherman besides the Troutbitten guys?
Oh, man. Fisherman? Larry Dahlberg.
Get out, really?
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, tell us why. That's a good question, huh?
Yeah, that is a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. He's done a lot of gear stuff, a lot of fly stuff, and he basically uses the tools that are the most effective for the situation and doesn't give a crap about what other people think about it.
Huh. Sounds like we need to have a Dahlberg podcast.
Yeah.
Get him on. Set that up.
Yeah, let me get on that.
Put Austin in charge. He's the event coordinator.
Yeah. Can you coordinate a hunt for big fish versus Troutbitten?
Hey, Deli, seriously, I've gotten questions about your Grinch streamer. The Grinch, right? This is something I know we've all been catching fish on, and we've mentioned it on the Troutbitten channels. We've mentioned it so people inevitably want to know all about it. And we'll put out a full recipe in an article and a video coming up, I'm sure. But will you briefly tell us about, I don't know, what's different about the Grinch and why you build it the way you do? Briefly.
See? Briefly. So, yeah. So, briefly is that it's built to contain water weight so that you can cast it long distances on a mono rig, and the variations of it make it visible so that you can see it well when you fish it.
Nice. You've kind of got it dialed in now too, don't you? I mean, when you first showed it to me, you were like, here's one I'm tying this way. Here's one I'm tying another way.
Yeah. And it's simple. Like
it is. Yeah.
I don't know, like 4 materials and you fish it. So if you stick one in a tree, it's not as painful.
It doesn't hurt that bad. Let's say hi to Matt Groe. He's another Western Pennsylvania native, now living near Bozeman, Montana. Matt's been part of the Troutbitten project from the beginning, and he lends that Western perspective from a guy who gets after it and fishes for river trout in Montana year-round. Matt, what's going on, bud?
Good to be back, like Bill said. Feels good, and been getting after it. I had a little hiatus from fishing. I had a new daughter born in January, and that really, gets into the fishing time. So I was skiing when I had opportunities to get outside, but It's funny, the winters lasted so long out here. I feel like I haven't missed any winter fishing, and I'm still winter fishing at the moment. I know I sent you guys the text message, but that's the way the conditions are right now. It's pretty wild. Going into even out here early April, it's pretty incredible the amount of snow we got. And the nice thing about it is it's not crowded out there yet. So yeah, when I've been going out and you see what you got to walk through to get to the river, it's ice jams out here create quite the hurdle to get to the streams, and you have to definitely be willing to get aggressive to walk to the stream, because those there's crevasses, and I'm not making that up. There's just like legitimate hazards walking to the stream. So not everyone's up for that. But if you're like us, you embrace that and walk through some, crazy stuff to get to the water, and you can have some solitude right now. So I'm relishing that until the weather turns.
Yeah. That's a flip from last year, right? And a couple years. You've been
big year.
Needing
Last couple
some
years.
snowpack.
Yep. Last couple years.
You're speaking French there with crevasse.
So a crevasse is a hole in
crevasse.
the snow.
That's what he said. Yeah. Yeah, right.
Do you take vitamins?
Austin gave a little raised eyebrow when you said crevasse.
Makes me think of Bear Grylls. He would always talk about that.
Yep.
Avoid the major crevasse.
Yes.
I know. It's true. I mean, I'm dodging crevasses, dude. I did a pot. I fell through up to my crotch through one, and it's they're dangerous.
Hey, that's post-hole digging.
Slooper won't even venture out on that stuff. I mean, I got him freaked out to the point where he thinks he's going to disappear into the crevasse on the Gallatin and never come back.
You got him scared enough to fall into a steaming geyser, let alone a crevasse that he can't see.
He still tells me the story about you and your wife and how scared he was when your wife put her head towards a hot spring.
She was fearless.
All right, let's say hello to Dr. Trevor Smith. Dr. Wool, as we've come to know him, is an Air Force trained physician who now heads up the Troutbitten medical staff, performing minor surgeries on ping pong tables and providing sound medical advice through long text messages. Is that fair, Trevor?
Yeah, that's fair.
Well, thank you for your service.
Yep. If anybody wants a ping pong table vasectomy, just shoot Dom a DM.
And they think we're joking, but
yeah, make sure you send them a photo so we know what we're working with.
You have to hold the mirror.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah. Send Dom all the pictures.
oh my. Trevor, you also popularized the orange bead head in our group, didn't you?
Yeah, I think I probably have the fewest standards of anybody in our group. So I go straight.
You think
for the
orange
jugular.
beads are dirty?
Yeah, I think it requires a certain level of humility, I don't.
It
Not-
more
I don't go
closely
in-
resembles power bait than it does flies.
I fish a ton of orange beads.
I know, I have been lately because of Dr. Wool. He's like,
Yeah.
here, try this one. Nah, here, kid, take 2 of these.
I fish them all the time.
You probably had it going before me, Groe, but out here,
I have 2 patterns that I'll only tie orange beads on.
same. Well, no, I take that back. I usually do an orange and then like a blackhead variant just to kind of flip the script if I want to. But yeah, there are certain streams, certain times a year, I feel like they outperform almost everything.
I know. And we're talking painted orange fluorescent beads. And I never
Yeah.
really used them until I got no problem. Like, you know me, I'll use anything. But Trevor starts telling me, oh man, this fly with an orange bead. I'm like, really? All right, I'll try it. And then I see him
Call it my Halloween
upstream,
variants.
nailing them. Yeah. And I told the story not too long ago about Trevor, more than doubling me up, like tripling me up upstream. Like he comes back, he's like, I caught 15 fish in the first hour or whatever it was.
You didn't see any of them though. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, been good. Now I've been putting that orange bead on all kinds of stuff, and
Yeah, you're seeing it now.
sometimes
It's not every day. It's not every stream. It's not every condition. But when it's on, it does seem like it draws fish more than
I know.
most other things.
I was telling my buddy Terry, I've been fishing more flies, different flies than I have for a long time. I'm just in one of those cycles, one of those phases where I'm going, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that. And some of, there's Bill's Grinch. I've been tying that. And the Ric Flair variant of the Grinch.
I like that Gunner
been on
Brammer
that.
fly you turned me on to.
Yeah,
I've been
the Gunner
enjoying tying
Brammer
that.
pheasant
Yeah.
bugger. thing. I put an orange bead on that sometimes. Been goofing around with patterns. It's fun.
Yeah. Have you backed off Perdigons?
I never really got on the Perdigon wagon too hard anyway. Okay. And Austin was telling me, like, that's what, now the trend's going the other way. Now Perdigons aren't cool.
Yeah.
Well, because everybody uses
cool
them
anymore.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that affects the fishing sometimes.
Oh, yeah. And we're going to talk about that, right? Mm-hmm. There's angler pressure. Before we get to that, let me introduce Austin Dando. And Austin is the unofficial, maybe now official, Troutbitten event coordinator. He also guides for Troutbitten, provides photos and motivation. Austin provides motivation because we all realize that if Austin is catching trout, then any of us can. You like that?
Hey, if I can do
That's
it.
a good one.
Right? I thought about that one ahead of time.
Can do it.
A man of the people.
I'm nothing special.
If some guy fishing left-handed can catch fish, we can.
Right. Left-handed, low talent, fishes like 10 times a year.
If you want to learn how to cast across your body, I'm your man.
Oh, is that what you were showing on your latest guide trip?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bill's even mentioned it before, but having a podcast directly tied to how to cast and fish across your body on your non-dominant side, that's a huge deal.
It is.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that until I started guiding either.
Yep.
It is underrated.
I agree.
It's a sore shoulder.
Underrated skill.
To happen.
Yep.
All right, but seriously, Austin, nice job on the new trail event. And that's something I didn't see coming, but the events might end up being an ingrained part of the Troutbitten project. It's fun. We were all there except the Bozeman guy over there.
It was a great time.
Yep.
Trust me, I got some asks if I was coming, and sadly I said no. This is the problem about living in Montana, man. I miss out on all that stuff.
And Troutbitten didn't fly you out, right?
I was going to ask. I mean,
a couple years.
Season 10.
Give me a couple years. We'll fly out for something.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have to
get lucky and we'll come to you.
That's right. You're gonna have to stop having kids though, because you can't be flying out with a kid that's what? She would have been.
She's
young. Like 6 weeks by then.
Yeah.
What's her name?
Macy.
Love it.
Great name.
All right. Yeah, this one is about angler pressure and how it affects the fish. What changes about the fish themselves? How do more anglers fishing our rivers change the habits of those trout? And are these changes short-term or long-term? Do these habits carry over to the next generation of trout? I'm sure that some opinions on what we do to accommodate these changes will leak in here in this discussion. But for the most part, we'll talk about the actual fishing next week. Tonight, let's stay focused on how trout behaviors change when more people fish for them. And in the next episode, we'll address how we accommodate those changes with our fishing tactics. Everyone got it? You understand the rules? We agree?
Yeah.
Deli. I got nods from everybody.
He's allergic to the word agree.
Mm-hmm. He's like, well, I have a different opinion.
I do not approve this message.
He does not approve it. All right. But we'd have like a 3-hour podcast otherwise. All right. I should mention, though, tonight we have no fisheries biologists with us. As smart as Trevor is, Trevor, are you a fisheries biologist?
I am not.
So full disclosure, no one in our presence has that degree. Like maybe someday we'll have one as a guest to talk about all of this. And
Josh almost has one, to be fair.
I was going to say, didn't Josh start out that way?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't count.
He's like 75% of
You're right.
Guy.
Right. I mean, I quit school the first time and I had to go back and change my major. I don't have that first major, do I?
No.
No, I don't have it. Anyway, really.
So.
All right. Instead, tonight we have the collected experiences and opinions of a bunch of dirty fishermen right here. We're guys who fish a lot, spend time on the water, talk with others who spend time on the water, and we have open minds and a curious nature. I think that's fair. The fishery science stuff matters, though. Of course it does. It's a big deal. And we'll probably bring up some of this in the discussion tonight, some of that data. But the more you research that data and the more papers you read, I know Trevor has read a lot of them, the more you start to realize how few of these studies have been done that actually apply to this topic and how much things get really complicated when researching wild trout. A popular study, for example, about trout migration habits charts the migration of a handful of trout in a smallish trout stream that is bordered by clubwater among the presence and influence of then stocked trout. And while that data is valuable, how much can we really correlate to the migration habits of wild trout in a river that's 300 miles away, 10 times as wide, with vastly different climates and so many other variables? So you get my point. I think the best data about fish as it relates to fishing often comes from the fishermen themselves. And that's where we're starting. Like, that's us. That's what we're trying to do is, talk some things through here about angler pressure. Now, we've had so many discussions through the years about angler pressure. I'm kind of excited about this. Whether it's after a fishing trip or at a backyard fire, you can bet the Troutbitten crew has a case of New Trail Broken Heels along with us. It's honestly our favorite beer. This hazy IPA is smooth and full-bodied. Hand-selected citra hops lead to notes of bright clementine and juicy ruby red grapefruit. Broken Heels is a keeper. New Trail beer is proudly brewed in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and delivered cold to your favorite craft beer retailer every week. At New Trail, it's not about being the best angler. It's about getting out there. So enjoy nature's moments and reward yourself for a day well fished with New Trail Broken Heels. It's Troutbitten's favorite beer. Imagine if someone put as much time, thought, and effort into designing fishing apparel as you put into finding fish. Well, someone did. Squala Fly Fishing builds waders, jackets, shirts, and pants so well designed, dependable, and comfortable, you hardly notice them. When you're wearing Squala, you're never hot or wet or unreasonably cold, so you can focus on more important things, like fishing. They don't make gear for everybody. They make gear for us, the like-minded few, serious anglers who don't take themselves too seriously. Check them out at squalafishing.com. Then use the code TROUTBITTEN10, that's the number 10, for 10% off your first order from Squala. Let me get this kicked off with the obvious thing. I think it's obvious. People would say more anglers kill more trout, right? So more angler pressure, that's how it affects the fish. There's going to be fewer of them in there, right? More angler pressure kills more trout. What do you think?
I'm going to jump in there, and I think there could be some validity to that the more pressure, the more mortality rate with the fish. But, from my experience, the higher the pressure, the fish, depending on the conditions, fish will spread out. So, does it, in a weird way, help the population if you have a large body of water that can contain cold, that has cold water, has good bugs for a long chunk of the stream? Do they relocate after a while, or
right on?
It's something interesting to think about.
It is. I think I found it interesting what you talked about in regards to how the best data is sometimes from the fishermen themselves. And I think that's 100% true. I don't think we always make the right conclusions based on our circumstantial or kind of anecdotal evidence, but I do think that some of the best data comes from our experiences on the water, because as you mentioned, when you look through the studies out there, one, it's incredibly difficult to find a study on angling pressure. When you look up anything to do with angling pressure or fishing, it almost all comes down to there are a myriad of studies on barometric pressure and its impact on fishing. So it's really hard to differentiate between angling pressure and barometric pressure in Google's vast genius.
Yeah,
but
use BART.
Right. Anyway. So the most applicable study that I found was a study that looked at two remote sections. Well, one very remote and one more commonly fished stream. And this was in New Zealand, and it looked at brown trout specifically, and they did 3-day trips on each river, on the more remote river and then on the more fished river. And the sections they fished over, they did 4 3-day trips over each of those river sections, and then tried to estimate the proportion of fish that they caught in the sections fished based on the surveys that told you how many trout lived in per mile. And they made a lot of conclusions based on the difference in experience that they had between the two streams and how the fishing changed over those 4 trips that they took on each river. And they found, but my whole point in even bringing this up, I might talk a little bit more about it later, but the whole study is really guys fishing and then counting the fish they caught, comparing it to the number of fish per mile, and making inferences based on that and what they concluded, which is just wild to see that in in a scientific kind of study, because it's prone to so many variables that could change your conclusions, and yet it's about as good as you can get because of how difficult it is to study this topic. I
mean, we can't even conclude that the fly that they ate is something I should keep on the line, right? Oh man, fish and variables are so big. Austin, you have something?
I was going to say, with more anglers, going back to the root of the question, I think the more anglers, I'd say you'd get more beginning anglers. And I think it's fair to say that a beginning angler may be less educated or less privy to the rules or the guidelines of safe catch and release principles.
That's very
fair. And the
fair.
more of those anglers you build up on the stream, the more fish that are interacting with perhaps poor fish handling, which results in a higher mortality rate. I think that's a fair, perhaps linear correlation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true.
They have to catch them first, though.
That's another good point.
Anybody can be lucky.
They could get lucky.
How much impact do they have? Right. That's a good point.
I don't know the answer.
I mean, one thing I was thinking about too, I mean, if you have an area with no special regs, then yeah, absolutely. And I've seen this, more angling pressure on a small stream that's 30 feet wide, and maybe they stock the bottom end and the top end is wild trout. Well, then you get more and more anglers going up out of the stock area and going into the wild area, and those fish, they're cropped. Because anglers can keep everything from, let's say, 8 inches up. You catch no fish that are bigger than 8 inches. And 9 inches becomes a trophy all of a sudden. So I think we've all seen that. And yeah, absolutely, more angler pressure can result in fewer fish in that situation. But guys, what about when there are special regs? Let's say it's catch and release. Is there any study that shows you that more angler pressure leads to fewer fish in the stream?
It's not very definitive, no.
I don't know of any studies, but just like you said, if there are more people catching fish, there's going to be a fish die at some point. And so more anglers will reduce the fish population. Just
maybe.
Even if it's by one. I mean, it's still reducing
fair enough.
That's
by
tough.
one, but then go ahead, Matt.
Montana does a fantastic job of doing annual fish surveys out here.
Yeah.
And it's safe to say that our pressure's gone up, right?
Sure.
Pretty much just like, any place in the sport, our pressure is trending upwards, and there are places where the fish population is increasing, and there's places where the fish population is decreasing. Sure. And I think that's just one layer to the question, right? Because I could also say, well, we've had warmer water, we've had drought issues, and so is the decline in the trout population, how much of it is all of it combined? How much of it is one thing? And then you think and then you see a study come out that a certain tailwater, is thriving, and it's got its highest trout population in 15 years, but it got fished the heaviest last year. So how do you explain that?
Right. We have that same thing around here. One of our most popular streams has more anglers than ever and also more fish than ever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One interesting study I came across was published by the state of Idaho. And this just, again, shows how different statistics play in. But they estimated, this was on rainbow trout, they estimated mortality in water under 69 degrees at 3% of caught fish if they were hooked in the mouth. So that was over a large period of time. They collected and then tagged and then followed those fish. If the temperature was over 73 degrees, mortality increased by about 68%. To 70%. So big difference in mortality, but that's 68% of 3%, right? So it increased, but it didn't make the mortality 70% of the fish. It just increased that 3% by 68%, right?
Got it. Still small.
Get that. Still small. But
mortality.
Angling success was so much lower in the hot temperatures that it actually, the conclusion was that you killed a lot less fish. It wasn't substantially beneficial to curb people fishing for fish over when the temperatures were over 73 degrees because nobody was catching many fish.
Because they aren't going to eat anyway.
Is what they concluded.
Like Matt said, you got to catch them to hurt them.
Yeah. And this was non-bait fishing, but they just suggested that because the metabolism of trout shut down so much in the temperatures that were deadly to them, that the impact on survivability and on population was so low that there wasn't much impact in trying to get people to stop fishing in water temps over 73
That's
degrees.
interesting too.
It's pretty interesting. Now, they didn't
great.
handle that group between 68, 69 degrees and 73 degrees. So there might be a case to be made for that population. But I just thought it was interesting because, again, it puts in context a lot of the discussion. When you talk about this, like a population of a species surviving, and if you're knocking off I mean, I'd be very curious to know in a given year on 1 mile of like our most local trout stream, what's the predation rate, on brown trout from, raccoons, mink, birds, eagles, osprey.
Trevor,
cetera,
those studies are actually starting to leak out into Montana for some management practices that have been put forth. And it's doing our hoot owl. People that fish in Montana are familiar with the hoot owl, right? Once it hits 70 for 3 days, you can't fish after 2:00. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I think it's kind of neat because it's like they don't shut it down completely, right? You fish during the cooler time frame. But they're toying with doing, I believe it's 67, lowering it to cutthroat fisheries. And saying once the stream hits 67, because of the data you spoke of, right, that there's the higher mortality rate, to do a hoot owl at 67. Now, there's a prime example. They have something coming down the docket that they could do those studies and say, hey, we did this, we implemented this, and the stream, they should do the survey of the trout population before, do it for a year, and after. And then or two. And then let's talk about the data there. Like that's
absolutely. I don't think you can know unless you do that kind of stuff.
Right on.
But I don't see that as an angler pressure issue. I see that as an angler education issue.
Go ahead.
So if an angler isn't educated and is out there fishing, that's going to affect the fishery more than overall pressure. So like when I think about
Austin's point, the higher the pressure, the more the inexperienced anglers. So there's like that, that relationship between what you're talking about and pressure potentially.
A little bit. I guess I just see it as the root cause of the issue is that the angler isn't educated. It doesn't matter if that angler fishes, whether it's 65 degrees, 70 degrees or whatever, the root cause of that is the angler wasn't educated and whether they don't know how to handle a fish or anything like that. It doesn't come down necessarily to water temperatures. In this case, it comes down to the fact that the angler wasn't educated enough to handle the fish. But I do agree with if there's an increase in anglers that are not educated, that don't understand the principles of how to handle a fish, it is going to create more mortality in those fish. But maybe on the upside of that, if that person learns those skills over time and then, maybe gets heavily involved in stream reconstruction and some of that, in the end, that person that got interested in it could end up giving back and in the end be a more positive influence on that stream.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. I think it's almost some of that will leak into the next podcast, right? I feel like we bring it back to the fish, right? And how are the fish reacting to all of the things we just spoke about with pressure and what do we see out there as far as changes as far as their behavior, right? And in correlation with the pressure. And I always think I see a couple different things, but I feel like part of what drives what the trout do, in my eyes, are a lot dependent on the current water conditions. And I think that's really, really important in what I see the trout do. And I'll talk about what you guys, Dom, you'd mentioned, you're getting a little worried out there with low water. And boy, I mean, if the low water coincides with the hatches and naturally the pressure, I think those trout react way different than where you have a bump in flows. You constantly have that high water and there's some sense of security there. I feel like they're more prone to staying in those prime lies. because they have some safety net. Whereas if you go into a prime hatch season and the water's low, I mean, everything about that situation is going to cause those trout to be spookier, right? Because they're constantly getting pushed. And so there's two different situations there for me. I'm like, okay, I'm just guessing I'm going to this stream and it's been low and, crowds have been heavy. I might react different because I think the fish are relocating and maybe they're pushing into unpressured water a little bit more so than if the water's high.
100%. I mean, I think it's so, you just think about like when you in low fall, say spring or low fall conditions with clear water, if you step in the water and send ripples out across the water, you might have just alerted 20-yard up and downstream. Every single fish that you were going to fish for might know that you're there. Versus with a bumped flow and high turbidity in the water, you could step into the water and alert 0 fish to your presence. It's just that's such a huge spectrum of difference, Groe, like you're talking about. I mean, and not to mention, if I go fish in one of our streams that just bumped 150 CFS and it's off color and I fish through an entire section, you could come right behind me and probably fish the exact same stretch and catch fish, right? That my fly was only presented to the fish that were within 2 inches of my drift or 3 inches or 6 inches, whatever it is. But there's such a small percentage of the stream that I'm actually exposing to my pressure versus in those clear low conditions, there's no point in you coming within 10 yards. It's just so different.
You guys are bringing up a great point. Something our buddy Steve always says, the most important thing is the water conditions. People talk about barometric pressure, and here we're talking about angler pressure and the hatches and everything else. The most important thing on a trout river is usually what you're saying, Matt and Trevor. The water conditions. Is it up? Is it a little bit dirty and stained? It might be a really good thing, and you can get away with then a lot more, let's say, angler pressure without it affecting the habits of those fish so much.
Sure. And the trout, real quick, one more thing, and then I'll pipe down and let someone else chime in. But that low water, those trout, think about how much more time they have to inspect, right? They have that much more time to inspect a dry fly. They have that much more time doing, and we're talking low water and what trout, what does pressure do to trout? Well, when you have low water and there's a lot of people out there, trout are more skittish, but they also have a lot more time in that low water to inspect the flies and become picky. Whereas if it's higher, right, they have to eat quicker. Those flies are zinging by them more, right? And so even if there is a lot of pressure, that higher water creates a little bit more, comfort zones for those fish. And then on top of that, they have to eat quicker because the velocity of the water's bumping.
Sure. Yeah. I think that depends on seasonality too, where maybe if it's closer to spring or late spring, those slow drifts, they may be especially picky, but in the wintertime, they may be holding in those patterns or those lies and feeling pretty comfortable with those slow drifts going by if they're not being altered unnaturally.
Yeah.
As fly anglers and tires, we understand the value of having the right tool for the job. AvidMax.com offers over 20,000 products and the knowledge to help you find the right tool for your job, whether that be at the tying bench or on the water. Listeners of the Troutbitten Podcast receive a special one-time discount code at AvidMax.com. Enter the code TB10 at checkout on full-priced items to save 10% off your order. Orders over $25 ship for free, so you can put more gas in your tank or beer in your cooler. For all things fly fishing and tying, elevate your game with AvidMax. Tactical Fly Fisher was founded by Fly Fishing Team USA angler Devin Olson to bring anglers cutting-edge gear and techniques from the international competitive fly fishing scene. Tactical Fly Fisher's aim is to help you improve your angling ability so you can have more fun on the water. Whether you need some flies, fly tying equipment, or a new rod or reel, they've got you covered. Head on over to tacticalflyfisher.com and use the code TBPOD10. That's TBPOD10 to get 10% off flies, fly tying supplies, or terminal tackle.
A couple other interesting tidbits out of that New Zealand study. So it was the Owen River and the Ugly River. I mean, it's already spot burned online, so be that as it is.
Pile on.
It's somebody's special spot, Trevor.
So I know. So sorry. So in the Owen River, which was the more commonly fished river, compared to the Ugly River, they found that the biggest behavioral response to angling pressure was found in the more remote stream. So in the stream that was less fished, the fish behaved much more drastically in response to that angling pressure. And in response to it, fish that had been caught and released were rarely seen over the next few days, up to 3 days later. And so they're doing a lot of sight fishing there, right? But they're looking for specific fish in specific locations. Oftentimes up to 3 days, they did not see those fish or sign of them. And no such hiding response was seen in the fish out of Owen River, interestingly, which was
where they're used to pressure.
They're used to pressure. Yeah. So, but a learning response was also evident, as trout that had been fished previously were more likely to be scared by anglers or required smaller, lower profile flies to be caught than the naive trout. So it's kind of interesting. And then that kind of, as I was reading this, I looked up, there was a study that talked about genetic response to angling pressure, which was really interesting, and how fishing and mortality rates impact like the next generation, and whether there's epigenetics where the behavior of the trout, like their genetics actually change based on the environment that they grow up in, or whether it's actually generation to generation, and both actually occur with trout, which is really kind of interesting. But within a generation, they actually modify their genetics to be less explorative, less aggressive, but then also generation to generation, fish that come from parents who were caught frequently tend to be less explorative, less bold, less aggressive. Yeah. And so it's interesting when you think about that, and like, say your mortality is 2 or 3%, but you put that over 100 years on a catch and release trout stream. What does that say about your genetics now versus 30, 40 years ago? And the type of fish that, we consider this part of the country having some of the, the most difficult trout to catch. Certainly there are a lot of places that claim that, and I think it's probably one of those things that everybody thinks they have that. But I do think there's something to the fact that even from a genetic standpoint, these hotbeds of fishing pressure in the country result in some of the most difficult to catch trout, because they have basically created subdued populations that are less aggressive, at least less aggressive during common angling times.
There's a lot there. Let me take the last thing that you said, in common angling times. Do you guys think that, let's say, a highly pressured river, do you think those trout will start to feed, I don't know, like at night more, or early morning when anglers aren't out as much? Do you believe that? Do you see that?
100%. Yeah. It
would make sense.
I think there's so many factors.
Sure.
That, during hatch season, it sees the most amount of pressure, but when that hatch kicks off, those bugs, those fish are still going to resist. Yeah. And so there's too many outside factors to say, hey, it's definitely angling pressure for me. But as far as like you talked about, Trevor, basically streams that don't see pressure, but then when they do see pressure, it affects them more.
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to fish some streams that, don't see pressure hardly ever.
Yeah.
And I do feel like some of those streams that I fished have then maybe gained in popularity, and I've started to see more boot tracks, and I've noticed the impact is greater there because it's a more, to the fish, it's a more drastic change, right?
Nice. Totally. Yeah.
Because you're a stream that sees, let's say, 10 anglers a day, that fish has kind of seen that, and it's happened before. And so they kind of know how to react. But the fish that hasn't seen that, maybe in 30 days or 40 days, when something happens and the fish gets spooked, it's so out of the ordinary for that fish that, it's going to react more drastically and maybe go hide under a log jam for, 2 days or something like that.
Bill, are those streams, some of the streams, maybe not all of them, but are all those streams you're talking about with that sensitivity level, is it all Class A wild trout water, or is there potential that those streams and those places are having some holdovers and they're just more susceptible to the, if a fish dies there, the population isn't self-sustaining enough, and you might be just seeing holdovers not replenishing each other because they're holdovers and not, it's not a true wild trout stream.
No, I've seen it on whether it's a class A, B, or C, like I've seen it affect all those streams. It's just that the angling pressure.
Well, you think about like if say a large predator moved into that region, you know, it would make sense the trout have an adaptive response to either leave the area or take more cover, right? And so the bigger trout probably find better cover, and the ones that don't have those lies or that don't have the social hierarchy to vie for those lies probably some of them at least flee the area, and those are the ones that survive. Because
interesting.
Yeah.
So we're bringing up a lot of variables. I mean, that's fishing. That's the way it is. And so it's hard to answer questions like, I wanted to talk about whether or how long we think it takes for a trout to reset after maybe you just wade beside it, or maybe then you wade right through it. I think it takes longer. We acknowledge if you displace the fish, it's going to take longer for them to reset. Or maybe you just float over them. And we've talked about that a bit. Like, how long does it take trout to reset? But really, I think what we're talking about is, and we're bringing this up, like, that's going to matter. They're going to reset sooner. I think we're all agreeing. They're going to reset sooner if they're used to boats coming over them. And if they're used to anglers wading through them. Versus a stream where, man, they hardly ever see anybody wading next to them even. And then they'll say, whoa, I got to settle down here for a half a day or days. I don't know, maybe more.
Well, and that's what Trevor
it's hard to
said
talk about, right?
The New Zealand stuff. I mean, it lines up with what Bill's saying. I mean, both of those things would be exactly what, right? You guys are on the same page with 100%. Potentially that.
So how do we talk about it, right? You know, so we almost have to take the median or whatever, like find the middle.
So here's a question for you guys.
Yeah.
Since we're directly on the topic. I had 2 guests with me this weekend, and we were talking about this subject and how long a trout is displaced or how long can it be spooked for. And they were asking me the question, what my thoughts were on how long is a trout spooked by a human walking by or a human wading by versus a deer running across the stream or a large tree branch falling into the water. How much can a trout truly decipher the difference between a human being and a deer and natural things occurring in their everyday environment all the time? Now, we happen to show up every once a month and displace them, but they have stuff happening every day. We're not the only thing they come in contact with. So how much can we really attribute to angler pressure versus a natural world?
That's nice. Great question.
And it can't be answered
what are your
necessarily,
thoughts?
But it's something to consider.
Right, you've been considering it for a couple of days now. What are your thoughts? What do you think?
I think there's this distinct difference between us hooking a fish, and this is kind of what I kind of got into, between me hooking a trout and losing it and spooking it, me having a direct physical contact, me touching that fish, me lining that fish, I don't know, something more obvious versus me just walking by a shadow or a ripple effect.
Yes.
I don't think me walking by hurts it any more than a deer or a tree branch or what have you, a rock slide entering the stream system. But if I go in there repeatedly and are piercing their lips and making them feel something, then maybe they'll gain a certain awareness of a human being. That's just my own guess.
I like it.
Yeah. The weird thing that I've seen is with like waterfowl with like ducks and geese that are on the water.
Yeah. I was just thinking that.
Like during sulfur hatches, I've seen ducks and trout feeding like right beside each other, and it's probably because it's kind of a learned experience by them to say, okay, it's safe. But like if an eagle or a heron or something flies over, they're probably more spooked by that, and they may go and hide because they may have had a negative reaction to that.
I've seen the same thing as you, Bill. I've seen rising trout right next to ducks that are actually eating those same sulfurs or whatever's on the water.
Yeah.
Geese actually seem to make a bigger disturbance, and trout seem to spook from, the disturbance of the water, because those ducks can just kind of be paddling around, and I guess the trout don't care about their orange feet. Maybe they want to eat their orange feet.
That's right.
There you go.
Orange feet.
There you go.
Hey, can we generally acknowledge that trout get more selective because of angler pressure? Is that fair? Anybody disagree with that? Matt wants to. I see his face.
Man, I don't know. I
please,
because I just think of some places out here that get hit all winter.
Yeah,
and I don't know if they get more selective. I'm going to say the old Griffiths gnat, right? Like they still eat a Griffiths gnat on the right presentation, and then I don't necessarily think they get that much more selective. There's only that bug on the water. Like that's all they have to eat. And then in that scenario, it's hard to be like, it's toward the tail end of the midge hatch. I'm still fishing the same midge I was fishing in February, right? And I'm still, it's the cast. The cast is more a thing in the presentation than the fish getting picky on my pattern, so to say, or.
That makes sense. So that's a size 20 or a 22 though. What if it was a size 12 and they got more to look at?
It's small. Maybe, right? I mean, maybe I'm with the, can we say like if it's a March brown hatch, toward the tail end of a March brown hatch, will they become more picky, on the pattern or is it the presentation?
Yeah.
I don't know. I can see it
that's
being
a really
thing,
good point because I feel for sure that they get more and more picky about accepting less drag, let's say, on a dry fly. They go, nah, I've seen drag over and over and over now for weeks and weeks. You guys know, for years, I've been the skeptic about angler pressure. I'm like, it doesn't affect them that much. I think it's overblown. I acknowledge these things, the angler pressure affects trout. However, in the last year, maybe 2 years, I've been really starting to, I feel like I can't deny it anymore. And in some of the local streams, I just feel those trout are getting more selective, more picky about both presentation and pattern. And I put it to Terry again the other day. I said, I feel like I have to stay one step ahead of the trout. That's why I've been trying more patterns, orange beads, white beads, no beads, with just fur nymphs and stuff like that. Another thing, we'll talk about it more next week, but I sometimes, I'm thinking, am I trying to convince the trout or make them curious? We should talk about that more next week. But I feel like I need to stay a step ahead of them because they are, I believe now, more than I ever have, that they are responding to angler pressure by being more selective.
So one thing, Matt, you kind of said the presentation, but I'd kind of elaborate on that is, so you're kind of an educated angler and a pretty good fisherman. I think we can all agree on that.
That's nice.
You're pretty good.
No.
He's pretty good. He's educated. He's smart.
I got rainbows out here, Dell. Come on.
That's right.
Looks dumb, seems smart.
But
that's Matt.
But
Good as you get with Bill.
I guess your presentations are pretty close to pristine, I'm guessing, most times. And so maybe that angler pressure,
he's buttering them up.
I know. Maybe that angler pressure doesn't affect you as much as the.
There you go. Yeah, I see what you're saying, Bill.
We're on to something.
Yeah, like you're not the one that would notice it as much.
Sure. No, it's a good, valid point.
Yeah, if an average angler that's getting an average drift, they may be affected by that angler pressure a lot more.
Yeah, I also think like outside of just
that's fair all the time.
Yeah. We're talking about like selectivity within one insect imitation, but like across the spectrum of what trout eat, I think there's also an impact, right? Where trout may be less likely to take bigger risks in more pressured water. So you might be less likely to, if you gave all the same stream conditions, you may be less likely to get them to make a bigger commitment towards a streamer in a highly pressured water versus a low pressured water. If it's naive, to angling pressure. And I don't think that always holds true, obviously, but.
So one other thing I'll mention is, and it's a mistake I often make, but I find, Dom, when fish are inspecting that pattern, let's go back to the March brown, and you have that fish nose that fly. And right off the bat, we're like, man, that fish is nosing that fly because it's leader. I'm going to quote leader shy or because he's been hooked. And sometimes, I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes I feel like we misjudge the stage sometimes of the insect where if you change the pattern, it's more how the pattern's laying in the water as opposed to the actual pattern itself. And so we may then, I changed the pattern. It was picky. The fish was picky and it ate a different pattern. Or did it eat a different emergence, stage in the actual emergence? Does that make sense?
There you go. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And you get back to, like I said, for years, I've kind of denied that, like, it's angler pressure is not that big of a deal. And I think we see things wrong, like, what you're saying. It's the stage the insect's in, the pickiness on drag or the profile, like you're saying.
Yeah, profile's big. Mayfly wings or a puffy. Like,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
right. Different things there.
Yep.
Angler pressure, I think, will affect the size of the fish, I think, at some point, because if that fish doesn't have the ability to sit and feed, let's say 24 hours, if that fish is constantly being disrupted by people waiting or people being fished to it, and it's becoming more selective, like we're talking about here, the fish isn't going to grow as much because it's not getting as much food as it potentially could be if it lived in a stream that didn't have, no pressure in it, and it could, move and feed. And
I buy that to a point, Dell, but as brown trout get over 12 inches, they become increasingly pestivorous. And so the number of meals they need per day do change. And I think that obviously is different, given time of year and like feeding on hatches and things like that. Because I think in the springtime, that's probably it looks really different, where we see a lot of the biggest trout in the river come up for certain hatches. But I could see that having its biggest impact on the growth of fish that are under 12 inches, not over 12 inches.
Yeah.
I would disagree with that. I would say the fish that is 12 inches is more educated, and it's more, it has more ingrained learning as far as what's happened in its environment. And so it's going to be pickier. It's going to be pickier because the pressure has caused it to react differently. If that 12-inch trout has someone walk by it every 3 hours or every 5 hours, it's going to be, it's not going to feed as much because it's more aware of the situation that's the angler being there.
I guess I'd say that they're going to find a way to feed, even if there's an angler on top of them every hour throughout April and May and June. Maybe you pick the most popular water and there's an angler on top. They see an angler every hour during daylight. I feel like they're still going to find a way to feed. And so maybe they do start to ignore those anglers to a point. We all know about the San Juan shuffle. And then another thing I was thinking is maybe they start to, I'm just theorizing, maybe those fish, like you said, Bill, they don't want to, they're like, angler around, I got to shut down. And then when they do decide to eat, they're going, well, I need calories. I am going to eat something bigger. So maybe they'll become better streamer eaters if you get the right streamer presentation. Maybe they do shut down and go, you know what, I'm just going to feed at night. And I know, Matt, you've talked about how you believe that a lot of times they'll get out of the main river and go up into some of the other ones, some of the tribs and whatnot, and go, I'm getting the hell out of here.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. Like, what do we coincide the lack of big fish with pressure sometimes, and the fact that they may stop eating, or are they just did they just get out of Dodge? Like, are they up the trib slamming on the same insect hatches, and everybody and their mom's fishing the river, and yet there's quality fish in the tribs at certain times? And that goes into, what do you guys think, how much do these fish travel based on the seasonality, and do we know? I mean, it's tough, right? Tracking fish is tough.
It is.
And I think I could see it depending upon each individual river and stream that they originate in, because if you have plenty of prime lies that offer good cover and shelter, you can distribute those fish throughout, and they get the safety, cover, and feeling of security that they need. But if you don't, I would almost think the bigger the river, or if it's like a good waterway that holds a lot of trout, but there's few prime lies, you would get a lot more movement back and forth depending upon the time of year.
Oh, that's a great point. And it's, it's just interesting to think about, because the fish have so much, not just pressure factors, but they have thermal factors. They have what's hatching factors, food availability factors. And when you have a really healthy river system, you guys, in Central PA, there's lots of healthy river systems. Those fish are not dumb, right? And they're going to survive. And the chances are, unless the hole is like 10 feet deep, right? And those fish can get down and almost avoid pressure regardless of the best anglers. Because let's face it, how do you get a nymph past a fish that's in a massive hole that's 10 feet deep? It's hard, right? If you don't have that in the stream, and that fish is trying to survive, it could go anywhere. I mean, it's just because it's a small little spring creek doesn't mean it can't have a 24-inch fish. I've seen it a lot of times, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Not maybe resident, but at the right time, you see some big fish in weird places.
That's a good point.
For over a decade, Smith Creek has provided innovative, high-quality fly fishing accessories designed to put your gear in easy reach, free up your hands, and keep our waters clean. For 2023, check out the all-new patented tippet holder. Each unit is individually machined from billet aluminum and anodized in 2 eye-catching colors. They hold up to 5 tippet spools with a spring-loaded plunger that is quick and easy to use, keeping your tippet spools right where you need them. Also, the brand new Rod Clip Plus comes with an improved 304 steel pin, plus a carabiner clip, giving you 2 ways to attach it. All Smith Creek products are built guide tough and backed by solid customer service. To learn more about Smith Creek products, visit their website at smithcreek.co.
To your point, Matt, like I think it's water quality thing too. If you got a healthy river system that has cold feeders, and you know that river system, those fish may feel more comfortable moving in and out of them if they have quality water in the tribs. Where if it's another river system that may not have quality water in the tribs and they're kind of stuck to that main river system, then it might change, and they might not be able to find shelter because there's if there are so many fish per mile, there's so few areas for those fish to shelter.
I like that.
And do you ever catch really big fish and I say really big fish, I'm talking namers, big.
Oh yeah, sure. Even over 20, but go ahead.
Yeah, but to your point, maybe that's one of the factors and why they can't get that big, because to Bill's point, they're like, you're stuck up high, there's thermal issues down low, and the feeders are not healthy. Okay, well, those fish are probably not going to ever get, super big unless the depth, maybe, if the depth's there, maybe.
One of the things I said is that I am buying into the idea that angler pressure is really affecting some of our rivers. And I talked to my neighbor last night, and we just had the official opening day of trout season. And that means people can fish even the stocked waters and the non-regulated waters. And so he went out and without saying too much, he fished one of the trips, and I had fished the main stem in really one of the most popular areas. I often like to do that just because I know there's been a lot of angler pressure. I didn't get out till noon, and I would estimate, it's fair to say, I was probably the 5th or 6th angler to go through there, the place I was fishing. And I caught 5 fish in maybe 2 hours. I felt like it was, kind of tough. The sun was out. I had all kind of excuses. I talked to my neighbor, and he had fished the trib. Oh, he was in the morning, but he caught 30 fish. And he showed me pictures of a couple that were, 17, 18 inches. And I'm like, damn, I don't even find those, on a good day in that main stem right anymore. And everybody's telling me, oh, the fish are smaller in here than ever. And, you got to go smaller and smaller with your patterns too. And I know what he was catching them on. They were not small patterns. Whatever. There's a lot to be thought of here. I noticed none of us have the answers.
I think if every day at 4:00 you try to eat and somebody walks in and smashes your plate and doesn't let you eat every day, at some point you're either going to change when you eat or change where you eat. And so I think that
is great.
That's a good analogy.
That is fantastic. That's what we're saying.
Yeah.
Dom, you and I have talked about, let's say when the Squirmy Wormy came out. And in the most popular river, that fly did great. Yeah. And even the most popular stretches.
Yes.
And after a while, that fly kind of burned out.
It did.
Now, when you go up into some of the very least fished sections of that river that may not see anyone for a couple weeks on end.
Right.
But those fish seem to be just as aware of that pattern being a cautionary tale than the ones who are pressured the most. Right. And what does that tell us? What kind of correlation is that?
Yeah, that is one of the most confusing things to me, the most baffling things to me, is it seems like they've genetically learned it through just a few generations and passed it upstream. I don't know. I guess, we know they migrate for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I was going to say migration.
Right, to spawn. And so those genes to, go eat the pink squirmy wormy seem to
must happen so much faster than we think.
Yeah. And Trevor, you kind of touched on that. You said they're learning real quickly. They're making those adaptations quickly.
Yeah, the study does. It's literally called, it was published in the Ecology of Evolution Journal, 2021, March. and it's called "Does Parental Angling Selection Affect the Behavior and Metabolism of Brown Trout Par?" And they, in one generation to the next, they saw significant behavioral changes. Now, it's funny, it's a great study to read through because it really knocks home the point that we're talking about, where there's so many sub-variables, because they tested a wild, quote-unquote, population versus a hatchery population and tried to look at the differences between, and the results were just like all over the place. But all of the behaviors changed, but they changed in different ways than they anticipated. And they break down in the discussion why they think that's so, all the way from hatchery fish, which were exposed to light 24/7, and how that affected their behavior. And there's just like all these sub-variables that really changed what they thought the results would be to a different kind of narrative. But the huge takeaway from the study was just that every population of trout from one generation to the next, the par of that next generation came out of their eggs behaving differently already after that, and that's just an insane degree of evolutionary change, on that microevolution scale. It's and so when you again apply that, I always think like, okay, now how long have we been fishing this river? How long and how many people have caught that one fish? And like how often did this fish get caught growing up? And it's just insane. And then there's just a lot of impact that we probably don't give credit.
Yeah, that's really impressive to me that they can change so quickly. And I said, I've been the skeptic, and now I'm starting to, I have to admit, I have to change something because, catch rate goes down and whatever. That's the next challenge. Well, it's okay to me. It really is.
It's so cool though, because you could say in our own species, like, my parents, will make up that they ate sugar a lot. Like, and then, right, like I'm growing up and I ate sugar half my life, and I'm like, well, dude, I don't think, maybe we should back off the sugar, right? So it's like my kid's going to grow up, and this correlates to the squirmy wormy. Like, hey, you should maybe lay off the squirmy, don't eat the sugar.
See, that's good. And I guess, Matt's children will grow up better fishermen and smarter fishermen. And so they'll be able to overcome the genetics that the trout have also come through. So it's like, is there like a parallel in evolution?
Purple worm. Fish a purple worm, Macy.
Stay ahead of the trout.
The purple one doesn't work. Don't do that.
No, don't tell them.
That's why the idiots like me catch more fish with orange beads.
Put an orange bead on a purple worm and see what the hell happens.
Why is my daughter tying a marabou tail on a squirmy wormy? Wait a minute.
That is nuts to me that they can adapt so quickly. But that's what's fun about it. Yep.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense given the stakes in wild trout streams, where if those fish don't adequately adapt to the environments they live in, they'll quickly be extinct in those waterways, right?
It's funny, I think we're going to come around to a full circle where the most original patterns or the most originally fished patterns ever are going to become the most productive because they've been the least fished for that many years now.
Yes.
Simple. We're going to go in a circle again.
So I think it can all turn into an evolution as far, or just a cycle, because you start to fish the trout get overfished and harder to catch, and then you stop fishing for the trout because they're harder to catch, and then the fish have less pressure, and so then the fish start to revert back to eating more often, and then when you fish the stream again, the fish are more willing to eat because they've seen less pressure, and then complete the cycle.
I do think this impact, though, applies more to those attractor patterns versus the naturals, because if you're fishing a natural with a very good drift and, if you're fishing it with minimal impact from your tippet, etc.,
well, that's the thing, right?
The fish can't turn a natural down. They can't afford that, right? But when you're fishing it as an attractor pattern, you're relying upon this different instinct of the fish. One, to go for a large protein source, or two, to just act on its aggression. But I think that's where you really see those patterns fall out of favor. And we, like we've noticed with beads of certain colors, maybe they come in and out of fad. Orange won't work very long now that we've talked about it. So you better work on something else.
No, I'll tell you what, it comes down to, what Matt said. They're also going to be even more picky about presentation.
Yeah, that's true.
And then there's this, the other day I'm on one of our favorite streams the day before I guided, and I was using, we're talking all natural stuff. I was using the original Waltz worm, no bead. I'm using what I call fur nymphs, muskrat. It's a muskrat fur to look like a crest bug. I'm using a hare's ear, just real subtle, small stuff, being natural with the pattern, as you say, Trevor. And I felt like I was doing pretty well. Next day I guided, and we used some of those patterns. It was getting a little slow. It's hard to tell if it's a presentation necessarily or the pattern. So I start to rotate through patterns. We did a little better in the afternoon. Maybe, who knows why, right? It's fishing, so there's all these variables. And a guy stayed on and he fished. He tied on a blowtorch, number 12, with a gold bead, and just crazy, crazy attractive stuff, like you said, Trevor. He sent me pictures. And I mean, he's like, oh, it really seemed to make a difference. He's like, just like you said, just start rotating through patterns. And I'm like, man, I wouldn't have rotated through that pattern, but good job. I'm like, that's it, man. It's hard to stay a step ahead of them.
How deep is your bench of flies? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's crazy. I kind of love that there's this unknown variable in fishing that's always a mystery. Yeah, exactly. And that
it is a great mystery.
Sometimes the guy that catches the most fish is the kid that started fly fishing last week, and he walked out there with a fly that has no business on the water. And yeah, I think there's something cool about that. I think it's also frustrating because you want to pin these things down and sort of figure out the equation that's going to get you the most fish each time. But I do think you've talked about this, Dom, how much fun you have. Sort of every single day is almost its own puzzle, and getting out on the water and sort of figuring out for that day on this water with these conditions, what's going to be the trigger, or what's going to be what is going to find me success.
Sure.
I think that's for all of us, one of the things that keeps us coming back.
Oh, yeah. And we know that with the rigs and the tactics that we hope we have, that we can control a lot of that. We can control, we can get the kind of presentation that we want with that fly that we've chosen. And then you can start to think about water types and water depths if you're underneath and all the other stuff. We're in control of some of it. And then there's so much that's just left up to the fish.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's fun to theorize about it. Anything else, guys? You got something?
Quick. Yeah. And I just want to go back to trout respond by changing their feeding patterns.
Okay.
In regards to the pressure, and I'll just hit this high level, but it always seems like the trout feed when the bugs are out and about, and we tend to think that, I feel like later in the season, that the fish end up, let's say June, the fish have been pounded and man, they feel like they're starting to eat at night. But when you really look at when the bugs are active, it's that spinner fall that happens at 8:45 at night, right? And the fish, then all of a sudden, all the fish in the river are eating, right? And it's not so much
regardless of angler pressure.
Right. Like it didn't matter what happened during the day, but if you took a sample of how many bugs were out compared to early May when the first round of sulfurs come out and all the fish are eating during the day, right? Well, they ate during the day and angler pressure did not stop, the gray fox eating, the March brown eating, the sulfur eating. It just so happened that the bugs changed, right? So how much does that play into effect as much as the pressure? And it's just neat to be able to think about really that cool stuff,
I think,
right.
Yeah.
I think one thing as far as fish resetting, I feel like there needs to be an event. So meaning event meaning like there's a big hatch of bugs that kind of resets them, or there's a big water event where, water comes up and more food gets pushed into the river. And so I don't know, when I think about when do fish reset, it's an event. It's either whether it got dark out or the lighting changed or, it, and I think the more pressure, the bigger the event needs to happen to cause that reset. So like if a stream is low for like 4 months and it's constantly seeing pressure, it's not that the, light and dark as far as like the, at nighttime, it's not enough to reset the fish because it's been so long, where if you would get a high water event and it would flood for, let's say, 2 days, that I think would reset the fish.
That's cool.
Yeah, right on.
Good point.
And we've seen that. We've had long falls without rain in the last couple. Yeah. And you finally do get that rain, and not only does it make you feel good, it definitely makes the fish, feel good, spread out, like you're saying. And then they get a chance to, spread out, to migrate, even to just locally migrate over to the bank side because there's finally water over there. Or maybe they do want to travel a mile or two or more upstream, downstream, spread them out.
No, that's all.
I was just thinking about migratory patterns of salmon and how, there are areas of the country where they get just slaughtered by bears every year, and anglers all, in Alaska, there are places that people know they're going to be migrating in. And does that keep generation after generation from following those patterns? Of course not. But so there's certainly a hierarchy of biological need. And you were touching on that, Groe, I think, when you talk about, like, look at the patterns of hatches every year and how they're conditioned to those hatches. There are some behaviors that they're going to follow regardless of pressure. And on our most pressured waterway that gets just thrashed day in and day out, you can still walk flat to flat and see them picking off blue-winged olives at the right time of year. Doesn't mean they're going to not run for cover the minute they see a shadow, but they're going to follow those behaviors to the extent that they're able, because they frankly can't afford not to eat, right?
Oh yeah.
And to follow the push to survive and to reproduce is so strongly wired in them that supersedes their desire to survive, to preserve self.
Sure. And species, you brought up salmon, but within the trout family, right? There's different species. And I will say from my experience, because we have a lot more rainbow trout out here, I would say that the mature brown trout is much more susceptible to pressure in different forms than a big mature rainbow trout or a big mature cutthroat trout. And that's just a hunch, but I feel like you'll have those big mature browns react like that big whitetail buck more so than a big rainbow trout that's the same size. And I don't have any data to back that up. That's just an assumption.
But the data that I kind of heard around that, Matt, a rainbow trout, I think its maximum lifespan is like 5 to 6 years, where a mature brown trout, the maximum lifespan is more like 10 to 12. And so
that's cool.
It's got more experience, and so I would say that's probably why.
It's a great, there you go, great data point right there. Yeah, I mean it makes sense, right? I mean, brown trout are
that's cool.
Yeah,
like Sloop, really old and really wise.
But I was gonna bust Sloop, but he still's not catching the whiskeys. Love you, Sloop.
Are we gonna get Sloop on one of the podcasts this season?
He can just come over and hang out in my closet.
He's coming in.
That'd be good. All right. There it is. Angler pressure number 1. How more fishermen and more fishing affects the fish. I think you can hear us acknowledge there are no sure answers about any of this stuff any more than there are certainties about pattern selection and reasons why trout ever take our flies in the first place. Yes, there are good reasons to have theories, but our doubt about those ideas never leaves our minds. The infinite variables encountered on a trout river weave a complicated mystery, and aren't we grateful for that? Next week, we'll be back with our second part of this discussion on angler pressure, and we'll talk about how we might change our tactics to accommodate the changing trout. So look for that one in your Troutbitten Podcast feed. All right, Trevor, will you read us out?
Yep, I'm on it. Remember, the Troutbitten Project is a free resource for all anglers. The Troutbitten website hosts over 900 articles with endless stories, commentaries, tactics, tips, and more. Find what you like through the top menu and through the search page. Navigate by way of the categories and tags, too. Be sure to find the Troutbitten YouTube channel currently featuring the Troutbitten Tip Series in collaborations with Wilds Media. These are short, useful, and unique tips for your fly fishing life. Thank you for listening to the Troutbitten Podcast. Please give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and leave a comment because it really helps. Until next time, friends, fish hard, enjoy the day, and find your life on the water.
Do you take vitamins?
Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
Avoid the major crevasse. I got to recharge my batteries.
Yeah.
Ooh, Trevor, are you a fisheries biologist?
I am not.
Woo! Woo! Woo!
Papa Shango.
It requires a certain level of humility, you know?
It's somebody's special spot, Trevor.
Josh Darling fishes with bait.
That's what I heard too.